Good evening. This is the fourth week of Radical Anthropology's spring term, which is themed The Real Dawn of Everything, but we are taking a break out of Human Origins this week for one of a kind of occasional series on contemporary anthropology in the Middle East. Very glad to welcome Geoff Hughes, who's lecturer of anthropology at Exeter University and author of the book Affection and Mercy, Kinship, Islam and Jordanian Marriage Crisis. And so we're going to hear more from Geoff about this subject. Very interested. So please take it away, Geoff.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kamala. Thank you all for taking time out of your days to come hear me talk about my research. As she was saying, I have this new book out, which you can see here, Affection and Mercy, Kinship, Islam, and the Politics of Marriage in Jordan. And I'm going to be talking today about a sort of a sliver of this research, although it is also more of a sort of attempt to basically sort of interest you in the book and my larger research project, but specifically basically trying to pitch it more towards an activist audience. So sort of thinking about activism around marriage in Jordan, as a sort of a way of thinking about activism more generally, and sort of different kinds of activism, different approaches to activism, and various perils and pitfalls. Now, that being said, I always feel like I have to begin by pointing out that I never set out to study a crisis of marriage. Instead, it seemed to fall into my lap. I had studied Arabic for years and read up on it and every aspect of the Middle East. But when I arrived in a village in Jordan as a Peace Corps volunteer teaching English, which you can see here in the background at one of our many weddings, all anyone seemed to want to talk to me about was marriage and how it was in crisis. My new and almost exclusively male friends found my studied lack of interest in marriage as strange as I found the constant talk of weddings, matchmaking, and home decor. When I wasn't commiserating with men my age about the difficulties of organizing the money and labor to get married, we were doing it. The prestations of marriage were a fundamental part of village life, the house construction, the mahar or bride wealth, and of course the weddings and engagement parties. Whether carrying cinder blocks or trays of tea, a huge amount of activity in the village was devoted to marriage. And people had a very clear idea of what it took to get married and why it was increasingly out of reach. For most of my friends, the main barrier was housing, the ability to marry and house one's sons, representing a very specific sort of ethical, moral, and ultimately political act. The most successful men could even aspire to become houses in their own right of a more metaphysical and transcendental sort, maybe even achieving the sort of immortality reserved for those otherwise long forgotten patriarchs memorized in ancient toponyms that still dot the landscape, Beit so-and-so, Dar Fulan, Kufur so-and-so, and Abu Fulan and the like. Villages where I have lived in Jordan often feel like giant construction sites, with new houses being thrown up in every gap in the fabric of the built environment to accommodate the burgeoning population of men working to establish new households. In their splitting and branching, family trees are instantiated in, quite literally, concrete form. Many of my interlocutors found that the choice was clear and stark: participate in multi-generational kinship projects that defy village life, or take one's chances as a deracinated and relatively capitalist worker in a precarious urban service economy. So when it came time to pick a topic for research, the choice was obvious. And I was fortunate to find that sociologists like my mentor, Francis Hasso, and historians like Hanan Khalousi were already actively developing the topic, picking up on the same zeitgeist that I was. For Hasso, marriage as a crisis discourse represented a conservative patriarchal governance agenda that promised to use marriage to moderate the excesses of the marketplace in so many of the ways the state once did. Of course, the sort of anxieties that Hasso so incisively documents through her analyses of mass-mediated controversies around marriage are hardly novel. In fact, Khalousi, a historian, shows how persistent the rhetoric of marriage crisis really is in places like Egypt. With the coming of the Arab Spring, the notion of marriage being in crisis only seems to further captivate audiences, with people like Farha Ghanam and Marcia Inhorn sensing new emergent forms of masculinity, and in a more activist vein, people like Mona El-Tahawi calling for a sexual revolution. All of this interest in the crisis of marriage, gender, and sexuality has not gone unchallenged, though. Paul Amar, for instance, has pointed out how a fixation on gender and sexuality in crisis can easily serve racializing neocolonial agendas. At the same time, it seems unsurprising that his own later work has come to focus on a whole host of relatively grassroots initiatives coming from within the region that explicitly declare gender and sexuality to be in crisis. In fact, as the historian Stephanie Kuntz argues in her fascinating history of marriage, marriage today seems to be in crisis virtually everywhere. There's even an argument to be made, as the late anthropologist of Jordan, Richard Antoon, did in the 1960s, that marriage always represents a crisis in social structural terms. Yet I would argue that there is still a heuristic value in a comparative study of marriage crisis discourse. Here, I would again draw inspiration from Khalousi's work, specifically her collaboration with Christine Salello, which notes that marriage crisis in many ways becomes a ubiquitous feature of modern nationalist discourse, each marriage crisis, like each marriage, perhaps unhappy in its own way. Moreover, as the anthropologist, I'm very aware that however important marriage may be as an increasingly politicized rite of passage now, it need not be figured normatively as the most important, costly, and elaborate rite of passage in a community's social life. For instance, Victor Turner's classic study of rites of passage focused on a puberty rite, which, ironically, he found more significant to how women work through the social tensions involved in marriage and patrilocality and their accompanying migration to the husband's villages than the wedding itself. Julian Pitt Rivers reckoned that the marriage was the third most important rite of passage in Catholic Spain after baptisms and funerals. And in other parts of the world as well, people may deem funerals more significant than weddings, reasoning that one may marry many times over the course of a life, but that everyone only dies once. Richard Kasiara illustrates this vividly in his work on the Luo of East Africa when he describes relatives who must store their deceased loved ones in the morgue for months until they can afford a proper burial. Gillian Philly-Harnick, another mentor of mine, has taken this even further, describing how funerary practice in colonial and post-colonial Madagascar came to constitute a whole political economy of death, as people turned to ritual to contest and make sense of their incorporation into the global capitalist system. The question of where to place the ritual emphasis within the life course can also be subject to conscious elaboration as a form of social critique. For instance, Islah Jad notes in the study of the phenomena of mass weddings in Palestine, a close relative of the mass weddings that I will discuss at the end of this paper, notes that they are particularly appreciated precisely as a break from the funerary rites that inevitably dominate life in times of political upheaval for the Palestinian people. In short, depending on the time and place, any event from a baptism to a bat mitzvah to a confirmation to a quinceañera might prove to be the most significant to the life of a given community or individual than getting married. So if anxieties around marriage play such an outside role in politics, it must be diagnostic of deeper social tensions, and it becomes the job of the analyst, in this case me, to discover what these might be. And so this is my attempt to basically set up my argument here and why I think we need to look more closely at this sort of marriage activism. So my argument today will focus on Jordan, where I've done over 4 years of ethnographic fieldwork. It's a relatively small, resource-poor country that has increasingly become a central node for refugee provisioning, with conflicts from Syria, Palestine, and Iraq swelling its population and raising the stakes when it comes to legitimating one's citizenship claims. As in most of the region, citizenship is only conferred to the legitimate children of male citizens, all the more reason for people to care about marriage. What I want to explore here is in this talk is how earlier, quite contingent outcomes over the crisis of marriage come to shape and impinge upon the subsequent development of these struggles in different ways. What I want to emphasize is how both individuals and institutions come to shape and be shaped by controversies around marriage. I argue that this dynamic can produce a sort of participatory technocracy in which social actors begin to see a potential for social change and self-actualization by accommodating their activism to existing social infrastructures. Yet, by the same token, that very accommodation can draw these actors into structures of accountability not fully of their own devising. My argument is based on ethnographic fieldwork conducted in Arabic in Jordan from 2010 to 2013 at the Sharia Courts, court archives, and an Islamic NGO called the Chastity Society. I've also attended about 70 weddings and engagement parties in Jordan, observed about 100 couples get married at the local Sharia courts, interviewed members of the Chastity Society, attended their events, and read about 20 of their pamphlets. My ethnographic arguments are supplemented here by oral historical research and a statistical analysis of over 800 contracts for marriage concluded between the years of 1926 and 2011. In this talk, I will compare 3 different ritual enactments of legitimate marriage, emphasizing the different notions of individual autonomy, collective responsibility, and social hierarchy that they presuppose and entail, but also how they build upon and wrestle with the affordances and limitations of pre-existing structures. I'm going to begin with the marriage rituals of Jordan's customs and traditions, showing how a host of conflicts and antagonisms between town and country, rich and poor, native and newcomer, are increasingly heightened within rituals. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to show how largely urban elite Islamic activists have come to play an increasingly central role in legitimating people's marriages in the last few hundred years. In doing so, they have often managed to successfully ally themselves with people who might otherwise be antagonistic towards them, often by offering solutions to gendered and generational conflicts. In the final part of the paper, I'm going to argue that one prominent activist organization known as the Chastity Society continues this tradition through grassroots forms of mutual aid, even if, much like its predecessors, its attempts at legitimating marriage sometimes fail and end up calling its own legitimacy into question. In fact, each of these institutions has found its own legitimacy increasingly bound up with its ability to legitimate people's marriages, and the tensions between these competing institutional practices can reveal deeper fissures between state institutions, Islamic activists, and extended kin groups. So, on to our first ritual enactment of legitimate marriage, here focusing on the proposal delegations and weddings associated with Jordan's customs and traditions. So to this day, most marriages are arranged, or at least discussed as if they were arranged, and involve an organized delegation from the groom's family, which would travel to meet with the bride's family. And here you might get together with your 50 to 100 closest friends, and upon arrival, the family would separate by gender, and at least on the men's side, a very particular kind of ritual would unfold. The senior man from the groom's family would express his family desire to get closer to the bride's family by getting to know what's her name or your navel daughter or some other circumlocution to avoid the taboos around uttering the name of an unrelated woman. Then the families would agree on a bride wealth payment. Oh boy, 1 second. Let me get back there. Sorry about that, a little technical difficulty. So basically they would negotiate what's known as a bride wealth payment or mahar. This is a sort of alimony payment to the woman in case of divorce or the death of her husband. And having negotiated this sort of bride wealth payment for the bride as the culminating gesture of the pageantry surrounding the delegation, the representative of the bride's family would offer a small cup of coffee to the representative of the groom's family. Here you can actually see Jordan's King Abdullah getting in on the act as he accepts a cup of coffee from a sheikh's servant. By drinking the cup of coffee, the representative of the groom's family would seal the agreement. Then those assembled would recite the opening verse of the Quran, known as the Fatiha. And with that, the coffee would be served for all of the attendees, followed by tea, Pepsi, and sweets. The ululation of the women would erupt in the Muharram, or the women's section. And when the delegation was finished, the groom's family would file out, shaking hands with the bride's family once again, and return home, often, at least in my neck of the woods, to the sound of celebratory gunfire. Now, of course, opinions within Jordan differ greatly about what all of this signifies and whether it's good or bad. Whatever their thoughts on the surrounding pageantry, though, most schools of Islamic thought would, at least in the absence of objection from the bride or groom, agree that the proposal delegation can constitute a valid marriage contract with witnesses, bride wealth, and otherwise clear terms. Yet, for many Jordanians, of course, the proposal delegation simply marks the beginning of a long liminal period leading up to an even more spectacular wedding, despite the fact that their own neighbors, friends, and family may find the whole to-do a bit embarrassing and scandalous. For one thing, the delegation proposal conflicts with the notions of individual responsibility and autonomy promoted by the contemporary Islamic movement. Within the context of a delegation, the bride and groom can seem almost completely subordinated to the machinations of extended kin groups. Those who disapprove are apt to liken such practices to selling one's women. Moreover, the presence of powerful family patriarchs and celebratory gunfire strikes many as backwards, at least, and potentially also an affront to the state's monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. Most notably, perhaps, ritual also obscures important social realities. The discreet inquiries, the matchmaking work of senior women, heated negotiations over the size of bride wealth, the house, the wedding, and who knows what else. All of that is masked by the ritual of the delegation, which projects an image of familial cohesion crystallized in the figure of the tribal sheikh, the big man, or the face of the group, Wajh al-Jamia. But if the delegations provoke a good deal of anxiety and dissent among Jordanians, weddings can be all the more divisive. To borrow a phrase from the anthropologist Vassos Argraiou, who has written about Greek Cypriot weddings in a very similar vein, weddings in Jordan have tended to become mechanisms of cultural intimidation. The transformation of weddings into ever more exclusionary spaces is significant because weddings represent an important moment during which legitimacy depends on social recognition. To the degree that weddings entice a wide swath of the community to attend the festivities or push them away, they make powerful statements about individual autonomy, collective responsibility, and social hierarchy. Following a broader trend throughout the Mediterranean then, Jordanian weddings have undergone a transformation in recent decades, wherein older multi-day outdoor feasts have been abandoned in urban areas in favor of shorter weddings in purpose-built wedding halls among the poor and five-star hotels among the elite. As we will see, despite their somewhat different figurations of individual autonomy and collective responsibility, both the large and open outdoor weddings of the rural elite and the small cloistered weddings of the urban elite are designed to legitimate clear social hierarchies. Clearly, such mechanisms of cultural intimidation aren't new, but the types of weddings and the accommodating mechanisms of cultural intimidation have emerged in a context of urbanization, increasing economic stratification, and political polarization. These imply new notions of individual autonomy, collective responsibility, and social hierarchy by radically limiting the pool of people whose presence legitimates the marriage. Especially when it comes to newer five-star hotel weddings, class antagonisms and the widening cultural gulf between town and country become especially salient. This is about far more than using the imperative reciprocate to scare away the poor. Five-star weddings, hotel weddings intimidate through their monumentality, the elaborate security measures they employ, and their commitment to a specific notion of cleanliness, safety, and order. The villagers I lived with got the message loud and clear and explained to me why they avoid such weddings meticulously. A common refrain I heard was, "It's not comfortable." More quotidian concerns included things like, "Can I smoke? I would be afraid to smoke. And what would I wear if I wore a keffiyeh or shmag, the iconic Arabic headscarf that you might be familiar with? People would laugh at me." The most obvious manner in which hotels become a mechanism of cultural intimidation is through their sheer monumentality. Spaces like the Everest Hotel, which you see in the previous slide, or the Royale Hotel you see here, tower above the skyline, their glass and limestone facades shimmering during the day, and their elaborate professional lighting setups illuminating the nighttime skyline. One does not simply wander into such places. They tend to either be set off from the urban fabric like the Everest, or surrounded by busy roads that can make them downright impassable like the Royale, which you can see here. The interiors, especially the banquet halls, project an immaculate whiteness and painstaking attention to detail, mimicking in every way the Western dream weddings that Jordanians increasingly imbibe through television and film. I should add that I, like my villager interlocutors, don't really get invited to these types of weddings very often. I've actually pulled these images off their hotels' Facebook pages, which seem to hint at the kinds of depravity that my primarily working and middle-class friends tend to ascribe to them: drinking, gender mixing, and every other imaginable form of excess. And especially since these kinds of hotel weddings became a target for two high-profile bombings at the height of the Iraq War in 2005, all of the major hotels have upped their security precautions in ways that make them even less inviting. Blast walls have gone up to prevent ramming by car bombs, and everyone is subject to being patted down and having their bags searched upon entry. These sorts of measures are somewhat selective too, targeting people who look poor, uneducated, young, religious, or male as potentially dangerous undesirables. For Jordanians who don't have the benefits of foreignness and whiteness that I do, trying to pass a checkpoint requires a good deal of etiquette and savoir-faire. All of this is to emphasize the distinctive sense of cleanliness, safety, and order that the hotel wedding projects: the obsession with security, the rigid partitioning of time and space, the elaborate dishware, the ornamentality of the food, and the saturation of everything with an elaborate gauzy white. To emphasize the significance of all this, though, I'm now going to turn to the weddings of the rural elite and the aspirational middle class. So one of the most interesting reasons I heard for why elite hotel weddings made rural Jordanians feel uncomfortable was that there was no sharing of what is known as bread and salt, a form of shared substance and commensality that many in the Eastern Mediterranean believe legitimates lasting bonds of obligation and mutual protection. Among the rural middle class, this itself becomes its own sort of mechanism of cultural intimidation for two reasons. Firstly, because these weddings are self-consciously antithetical to the notions of cleanliness, safety, and order embodied in contemporary bourgeois hotel weddings. And secondarily, and this is directed at the poor, because the meat is becoming more and more expensive and pushing such weddings out of their reach. Currently, a kilo of local meat costs around 12 quid, which is definitely a good day's salary. Both of these dimensions of the feast's exclusionary logics produce significant material barriers that present certain categories of people, and especially the poor, from participating in the legitimation of marriages on equal footing. Such weddings ideally last 3 days, with dancing and healthy servings of tea and coffee. Their dramatic peak is the feast. Everyone shows up with their nakud, and divides himself by gender and makes their congratulatory gesture, a payment of at least 10 quid, slip discreetly into a family member's hand, which is of course a significant amount of money for most people in Jordan. That can easily be a day's wages for someone. When the food is ready, the guns are fired to welcome all comers, and everyone digs in like this. And we'll see if this video works. Otherwise, I'll sort of pantomime it for you. So you rip off, you stake out your place in the sliver of the overall platter, and you reach into the pile of steaming meat and rice with your hands, ripping off pieces of meat and pushing them onto other guests in a move which might give pause to Jordanians who hold closely to the germ theory of disease. Furthermore, eating with one's hands, while often denigrated by the urban elite as childlike, or at least some of them, actually requires a good deal of etiquette, especially when it comes to forming meat and rice into a stable ball, using scalding hot yogurt broth to hold it all together so that it can be tossed into the mouth. I might add that this can in fact be a quite bracing sensation if your hands aren't accustomed to manual labor, yet another contributing factor to the growing gulf between the aesthetic values of rich and poor and town and country. The size of these events when a powerful person is getting married can be mind-bendingly intimidating in its own right. So this is a still from a video of a wedding of a young man who had graduated as a lieutenant in the Jordanian Air Force. And here he was feeding not only his entire extended kin group, but also all of his subordinates, requiring a 7-minute long procession of over 100 platters of meat. Clearly, to fully partake in the legitimation of marriage in one's community now requires a form of keeping up with the Joneses that is beyond most Jordanians. I want to emphasize that this is a poor country. Most people can't do this. People put enormous efforts into trying, but they are not necessarily successful. There are bad weddings, usually because people lack the money and or the large amounts of labor that it takes to pull this off. By far the most commonly cited problem is the cost of meat. A kilo of local meat that includes bone now costs upwards of 12 dinar, or about 12 quid, which is more than a day's wages, or the amount most rural families would normally give as a nukud to avoid being labeled as a charity case. Sometimes people skip on meat and you end up with fewer hunks of meat than men gathered around the platters, leading to a delicate dance between attendees and concerns about there being enough left over for the women and children who may or may not be eating yet. Beyond the cost of meat, though, weddings also require hired help or relatives willing to fill those roles. This means carrying the meat, of course, in these giant platters, but also keeping their guests' teacups full, cycling around with coffee, and tidying up after a multi-day procession of well-wishers that includes a share of mischievous little kids and chain smokers. Increasingly, the urban poor and even members of the rural poor choose to break decisively with the forms of legitimacy and rural kinship reciprocity embodied in the wedding feast. They turn to wedding halls that have sprung up across Jordan in recent years that offer an admittedly ersatz attempt to replicate the elite hotel wedding. This generally consists of a large, somewhat dingy hall painted white that rents out 2-hour slots. The 3-day extravagances of old are boiled down into a brief procession, the receiving line for the nukud, or the 10 dinar, and a bit of dancing, Pepsi, and gato, which, despite its French name, is usually reminiscent of a Hostess Twinkie. What I'm saying all sounds awfully mean and shallow and materialistic, then perhaps you can imagine that the lavishness of weddings has produced something of a backlash. If all elite weddings run the risk of seeming more like conspicuous consumption than a welcome communal gathering of legitimation, 5-star hotel weddings only exaggerate these trends. Moreover, the mechanisms of cultural intimidation I've described here become quite the topic of conversation. The rural middle class talks about their discomfort at hotels, and they revel in the discomfort their adherence to tradition instills in both the urban elite and the poor. There's nothing preventing you from showing up with your own spoon or not slipping a solid day's wages into a groom's hand. And believe me, I know that people do such things because it's commented upon later. But to do so represents a more or less subtle attempt to opt out of a particular enactment of legitimate marriage, necessitating by that marriage's particular mechanisms of cultural intimidation. So you might be wondering at this point, whatever happened to the bride and the groom in all of this? As I've argued, their absence, at least in the objectified customs and traditions that we often have related to us via cultural institutions and oral historical accounts, this is a very deliberate thing, and it works to emphasize the collective authority embodied in the extended kin group and its chosen representatives. But this is not, however, for lack of an alternative. To the contrary, Sharia courts have generally taken a much more intensive interest in individuals in general and women in particular than the tribal wedding delegations like the ones I described before. In certain urban centers in the Middle East, the practice of writing marriage contracts like the ones I'm about to tell you about actually goes back to pre-Islamic times. Highlighting such continuities between pre-Islamic and Islamic contractual procedures, the historian Amira Sonbol, for instance, uses contracts and other court records to great effect to show how women in what is now Egypt were treated as legal persons in ways that Western women would not be for over 1,000 years. She portrays women representing themselves in court and often women against recalcitrant husbands. Her archive of marriage contracts shows that women often stipulated elaborate conditions in their marriage contracts, which provided grounds for divorce and payment of mahar. Working closer to Jordan with a focus on Ottoman, Syria, and Palestine, the historian Judith Tucker notes that jurists saw themselves as very much continuing a reformist project epitomized by the teachings of the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, aimed at protecting the weak and vulnerable from the machinations of the powerful, and especially forms of backwardness that they often associate with tribalism and the era of ignorance or jahiliyyah, when such tribalism was seen as being hegemonic to the detriment of all. And arguably, aspects of this reformist project, especially in the realm of marriage, were aimed at preventing abuses by powerful senior males and extended kin groups against figures like the girl of marriageable age, who were perceived by jurists as particularly vulnerable to exploitation. Tucker argues that these jurists took a notion of consent seriously and worried extensively about the malign influence that senior males might have on women's marriage prospects. One of the 4 19th century Palestinian jurists who Tucker profiles in the House of Law waged a campaign of sorts against various ways in which rural women often saw their bride wealth eaten up by their families, and especially senior males. Once married, jurists placed the responsibility for the provision of the wife's maintenance or nafaka squarely on the husband. If the husband was unable to or unwilling to pay, the court would go so far as to empower the wife to borrow money on his behalf in the market and then compel him to pay it back. Palestinian jurists in Ottoman times also took a more explicitly aim at tribal customs that, quote, reduced women to chattel whose sole worth lay in their usefulness to immediate family honor and gain. Among the more frequent targets of this were marriage by capture, bartering brides, and attempts to annul marriages on the grounds that a bride's broken hymen invalidated her claim to virginity. In each one of these cases, a vulnerable individual becomes the rationale for checking the prerogatives of the broader kin group and its members. And even in the earliest written contracts I've seen, recorded in Ottoman court registers that span all the way back to the 16th century, you can see a reflection of these moral concerns and their emphasis on the individuation and the defense of women and children. Even the earliest marriage contracts in court registers tell us that so-and-so was the present for so-and-so, the legal agent of so-and-so who married so-and-so. This is quite in contrast with the delegation, where even the prospect of uttering the bride's name is met with trepidation. In fact, to this day, rural Jordanian families almost never print the bride's name on a wedding invitation. Contracts also provide places for the groom, bride, and her guardian to sign, or in this case, provide their fingerprints, thereby registering consent. The focus of on the consent of the bride and groom is actually a notable shift from the proposal delegation, but it also represents a shift in the procedures of courts themselves over time. In fact, such has been the shift in sensibilities around the importance of conducting unmistakable indexical signs of consent from contract participants that contemporary judges were appalled when I showed them contracts from the 1920s where notaries had helpfully filled in the signatures of all the participants at the bottom of the contract. Nonetheless, the intense focus on distinct individuals has long been an important part of court procedures. Here's a page from an old Ottoman court register, which I showed you before, I guess, a little bit. And here the top entries of the 2 pages are land deals, and below them you're looking at a divorce on the right and a proof of legitimate agency on the left. Now, marriages were actually quite rare in the old court registers, since the registers were mostly used for recording the settlements of various disputes. And I guess this is a principle of no news is good news. So when the historian Judith Tucker looked at the court registers for Nablus, population 8,000, between 1720 and 1858, she only found 107 marriages, right? That would be less than 1 marriage per year, which demonstrates that even most urbanites, and that's to say nothing of Nablus's extensive hinterlands, did not register their marriages at courts. The divorces, land disputes, and proofs of agency do, however, give some sense of the kinds of conflicts that brought individuals and families to court, and they also indicate some possible rationales on the part of the courts for becoming ever more proactive about registering these marriages before those conflicts arose. So in the late 19th century, courts started to become increasingly involved in the legitimation of marriage due to something known as the Tanzimat, or the reorganization of the late Ottoman Empire, a major modernizing and westernizing initiative that drew liberally from the French Napoleonic model. And I guess I should clarify that the Tanzimat begins earlier in the century, but a lot of the stuff I focus on marriage, particularly in Jordan, doesn't really happen until later in the Tanzimat, once Jordan is basically reopened, and they basically opened the first Sharia court in Jordan in the late 1860s in Salt. So here we see that these old court registers are supplemented by a new technology, a freely circulating pre-printed form contract, which is filled out by a new figure, the traveling itinerant contract writer known as the Ma'dun. And so here are some early examples. And I would love to say more about them in a sort of a statistically rigorous way, but with constantly shifting administrative boundaries and changes to the form, it's very hard to know how to sample and interpret findings. You can see a lot of experimentation happening at this time period with these sorts of contracts. So you can see one from 1903 that's a pre-printed form, but then here's one from 1907, which is written freehand, then embellished with signatures as well as stamps, both official stamps from the courthouse, but also individual stamps from local notables who would be either sheikhs or maybe a mukhtar or something like that, or an omda. And those would, of course, be distributed by the Ottoman officials to particular individuals. And so what I want to emphasize in particular here is that when the British took over after World War I, they could only accelerate a process that was already well underway long before European direct colonial rule. So I want to caution against attaching too much weight to these earlier archival traces of practices that resemble the current workings of the courts, though. Residents of a highly bureaucratized society may assume as a matter of course that a piece of paper could bring the repressive powers of the state to bear on a recalcitrant spouse or forestall the imposition of these repressive powers. In Jordan, however, this has only been accomplished through a long period of negotiation, as precedents have emerged for understanding the complex entailment of court documents. The anthropologist, former intelligence officer, and sometime opposition politician, Dr. Ahmed Oued Abadi, offers one example of this process of negotiation in his doctoral dissertation. He describes how, during the summer of 1980, he was in the governor's office when a conflict arose over a young man who had impregnated a woman. She became pregnant while she was still living at her father's house after they had signed the marriage contract with the Sharia courts, but before the wedding and bride wealth payment. The father was furious, but he had been rebuffed by both the civil courts, who said it was a Sharia matter, and the Sharia courts, who maintained the two were married. The governor intervened, quote, to prevent the dispute from getting out of hand, and convened an impromptu arbitration session. And Dr. Ahmed, never being a shrinking violet, of course, found himself part of the arbitration session himself, giving new meaning to the phrase participant observation. Their ruling was that, quote, although the young man's action was theoretically legal, correct behavior is not to have intercourse with the fiancée until after the public wedding. Since the young man committed this act secretly in his father-in-law's house, the young man must pay all the outstanding bride wealth and should send a big delegation to his father-in-law and make a feast of conciliation with food contributed by the notables of the two parties. He also had to pay a substantial fine of 300 JD for hurmat al-bayt, or inviolability of the home, of his father-in-law. The young man was then required to swear an oath that he had not had sexual intercourse with the woman before the marriage contract was signed, so as to secure her and her sister's reputation. Otherwise, the sister's chances of marriage would suffer because of his action. The young man must take the woman to his house as wife immediately after this delegation. So a few things are striking about this passage, which is why I quote it in full. First, the state bureaucracy appears completely uninterested until the matter arises to the level of a threat to public security, basically until there's a threat of violence. Once activated, the governor's officials are forced to contend with the gap between the, quote, theoretically legal, unquote, and, quote, correct behavior. A string of obligations and entailments involving various networks and groups of people emerge. The bride wealth, the wedding, the father's sense of entitlement to hurmat al-bayt, or the inviolability of the home, and the potentially negative impact on the sisters' reputations. Despite the involvement of the state and its Sharia courts, the modes of individual autonomy, collective responsibility, and social hierarchy legitimized by the state ended up owing far more to those modes favored by extended kin groups, notably the enactment of non-documentary as opposed to documentary rituals. When faced with a potential riot by the bride's outraged family, the governor legitimized the wedding and the transfer of bride wealth, not the paperwork or the Sharia-sanctioned sexual prerogatives of the couple. And in 2012, when I was conducting fieldwork in the Sharia courts, the governor's office continued to serve as a key role in solving problems for which the documentary procedures of the courts were ill-equipped. Chief among these was the matter of elopement. On multiple occasions, I saw judges rush off to the governor's office to marry couples that had sought refuge from their families at the governor's office. Although these officials would only involve themselves in a marriage if the bride's father was willing to sign, this was explained not so much in terms of Islamic law as rather a matter of personal safety and a sense of propriety. Those who could not get the agreement of their parents were basically being married by the governor. So my study of court-issued marriage contracts demonstrates other ways in which these tensions between individuals and their extended families have played out through the procedures of the courts and the reactions of various applicants. To be clear, the courts, extended kin groups, and the governor's office all acknowledge the prerogatives of the older generation to exercise control of the sexual and reproductive potential of younger generations. However, the Sharia courts and the governorate attenuate these prerogatives by shifting the focus from the collective will of the extended kin group, the sheikh and the wakil or agent, to the individuals like the husband, the wife, and the wife's wali or guardian. The shift from wakil to wali that accompanied Jordan's post-independence revamping of its personal status code is especially significant. The former is an amorphously defined senior male, while the latter is rigorously delimited as the closest adult male kin of the woman, her father, in his absence, a designated male kinsman, usually an elder brother or a paternal uncle. And only in 10 or 20% of the contracts my sample from this earlier, more permissive documentary regime that held from 1926 to 1953 do we actually see a senior male who is clearly not the bride's guardian. Yet the increasing exactitude with which the courts register consent to marriages nonetheless represents a shift in power relations within families. The newer system of guardianship subverts the power of extended family in general, while legitimizing the authority of the bride's carefully delimited guardian in particular. So if you look at this chart, for instance, obviously, sort of a father could be a guardian very easily. And of course, given, high rates of mortality, a brother might very well be a guardian as well. But especially where there's no apparent relation at all between them, which is this 11%, or also categories, for instance, like the grandfather or the father's brother's son or the mother's brother. These don't really have any particular standing in most schools of Islamic jurisprudence, which basically shows a sort of a much broader understanding of what consent could constitute in this older documentary regime. So my ability to track such shifts in court procedures over time, though, is merely one of many strange effects of the concerted efforts of the courts to implement a system of information storage to aid in the legitimation of marriages. The careful work of generations of judges and notaries made it easy for me to build my database of marriage contracts, drawing on information concerning the names, ages, places of residence, employment, and religion of contract participants. The contracts also recorded demographic information along with bride wealth payments and later contract requirements. Besides, this clear grid-like structure with some predetermined categories and rigid rules for coding seems to virtually cry out for someone to aggregate it and produce a statistical report about it. And as we will see with the Chastity Society, I'm not alone in that. When I arrived to do field work, employees at the local courthouse in Madaba, where I lived, told me that they had been aggregating all of their data at the end of the month for the ministry for as long as anyone could remember. And by the 1990s, this information was seeping out into the public in pamphlets produced by the Chastity Society, an Islamic NGO that decried a crisis of marriage that they represented using tables showing the decline in the number of marriage contracts issued by the courts every year. By the early 2000s, the courts began publishing their own annual report, and by the mid-2000s, all of this information was freely available online. By the late 2000s, when I started my fieldwork, courthouse data had become a central aspect to debates over the crisis of marriage, which by then had expanded to include issues like the increasing prevalence of unconsummated marriages ending in divorce. This itself is a fascinating category, which, as we have seen, is purely an artifact of the court's own knowledge practices and the ways in which they interact with local wedding customs. And here I would also note the Chastity Society's sort of involvement. Oh, sorry, did I cut my video off? I apologize there. So the Chastity Society, in important ways, both grew out of the contradictions between the extended kin group and the state Sharia courts, and also came to reify them as new categories of political grievance: the unmarried youth and the woman divorced before consummation. Most intriguingly, though, if earlier marriage crises were defined by a lack of any real statistical grounding, as Khalusi has noted, courthouse statistics increasingly seem to play a profound role in structuring debates about the nature and even the existence of a crisis of marriage. And here I think the work of Amal Abdin and her work on divorce before consummation and in the first year of marriage is a particularly interesting example. So these are relationships, again, where people, they sign the contract, but in that liminal period between the signing of the contract and the wedding, basically things break off, often because they're not really allowed to see each other. There are a lot of tensions around money that arise, and they may just sort of decide that it's not worth it. But in her study, what Amal Abdin does is she uses the Sharia courts to get access to sort of women who have gone through this. And she uses a sample of 50 women divorced before marriage in the first year and 50 years divorced before consummation to create a new form of individual and collective voice. And while I think probably there's many ways we can debate her findings, which emphasizes things like the conflict between daughter-in-law and mother-in-law, quote unquote, men not taking responsibility, and of course, financial difficulties. I think that the aspect of the new forms of political contestation and gendered and generational conflict that these statistical categories and statistical procedures enable are worth thinking about, and especially as I shift to my third ritual enactment, the mass weddings and training courses of the Sharia courts. So in the summer of 2010, after years of hearing friends and neighbors in Jordan complain about a crisis of marriage, I began conducting preliminary fieldwork on marriage crisis discourse, which quickly led me to an Islamic charity called Jama'at al-Afaf al-Khairiyya, or the Chastity Society. Dr. Mufid Sarhan, the organization's director, graciously provided me with an armful of pamphlets and books his organization had published on the topic. These included didactic texts describing a proper Islamic family life and, more surprisingly for me, quantitative analyses of official statistics from the Sharia courts about marriage. He explained that falling rates of marriage were socially disruptive and threatened to draw the youth into illegitimate sexual relations, blaming the situation on a combination of government mismanagement and backwards societal expectations that put marriage out of reach for many. To mitigate the disruptive potential of the crisis, the Chastity Society organized an annual mass wedding as a more efficient and cost-effective alternative to the traditional weddings, and worked with the Jordan Islamic Bank to dispense millions in interest-free loans to young couples. The Chastity Society was led by President Abdul Latif Arabiat, who was the Speaker of the Jordanian Parliament in the 1990s when he was head of the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood's political wing, the Islamic Action Front. The organization and its leaders presented themselves as an alternative to the family and the state. So in some ways, this wasn't necessarily a surprising way to find a leading political figure spending his retirement, but I also did think that it sort of spoke to the key role that marriage plays in the contemporary Islamic movement. The Chastity Society felt, however, that the contemporary family and state was rendered illegitimate in their view because of its inability to legitimate the sexual relationships of the youth. Ironically, the Chastity Society was able to use the state's Sharia courts data as evidence of the state's failure to legitimate its citizens' marriages, and hence as evidence of the questionable legitimacy of the state itself. Here, the ritual hazards that await those who would try to legitimize marriages by legitimizing marriages play out through the medium of demography. The Chastity Society, for its part, sees itself as offering a solution to both the problems of legitimacy posed by both extended kin groups and the state. It is an Islamic NGO tied to the Muslim Brotherhood that has teamed up with Jordan's leading Islamic bank to distribute millions in interest-free loans to help thousands of couples marry, while becoming famous for its annual mass weddings. Here, sections of the urban middle class, especially pious small businessmen, have come together to organize a form of community self-help to aid its poorer members in legitimating their marriages and obtaining a somewhat dignified start to their married lives. But even here, the way they do so is polarizing, and a lot of my neighbors in the village viewed the whole enterprise with a great deal of suspicion, seeing it as a simple attempt to substitute a politically radical and possibly treasonous system of institutional patronage for the more personalistic type of patronage network with which most rural Jordanians were all too familiar. This elections mall, what did I do there? This elections mall political cartoon portrays the basic accoutrements of Jordanian patronage politics: the plates of meat, the swarms of supporters, and national ID cards, all commodified for the cigar-smoking plutocrats' nefarious ends. When I discussed the Chastity Society with people in the village, they were intrigued to find out more and wanted to know where the money came from, how much the beneficiaries paid, and how people found out about it, and whether one had to be part of the Islamic movement to benefit. I could tell them confidently that the beneficiaries of the Chastity Society paid little to nothing, that local businesses in the Jordanian Islamic Bank bore most of the cost. And I asked the Chastity's director, Dr. Mufid Sorhan, how the beneficiaries found out about the society, and he replied somewhat defensively that it was advertised in advance and everybody knows. Told this, one of my friends in the village named Abu Sakr sniffed, "I've never seen an ad, I've never seen an invitation. How do people know when to sign up?" My response that beneficiaries were heavily concentrated in the refugee camps, where the Islamic movement's social services are stereotypically concentrated, only heightened the suspicion that this was a privilege reserved for supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. Abu Sakr, for instance, a veteran of security services, a proud Bedouin tribesman from the east bank of the Jordan River, and an ardent nationalist and frequent critic of the Islamic movement, spoke for many when he confidently told me that it was a vote-buying ploy. This was a frequent accusation leveled against people who throw elaborate weddings in the village, and one that I had heard Abu Sakr himself level against certain big men in the area. Abu Sakr was no secularist or modernist, though. As he once told me, if there was a real Jordanian Muslim Islamic brotherhood or Islamic movement, I would be the first to join. But there is no real Jordanian Islamic movement, just a Palestinian Islamic movement. He saw the Chastity Society as a front for rabble-rousing political opportunists preying on the desperation of the camp-dwelling poor by offering to extricate them from the pre-existing patronage networks that legitimate themselves through elaborate pageants of hospitality at weddings. Whether or not the Chastity Society is really reducible to a simple ploy to obviate the reliance of young people hoping to marry on their extended kin networks and the patronage of senior males through a new putatively modern network of exchange and social welfare provision, people found the whole thing a bit weird and threatening, even if it provoked fascination as well. The Islamic activists who led the event did little to disabuse people of such reservations either. The most dramatic moment of metapragmatic reflection on the whole mass wedding came with the speech of Dr. Abdul Latif Arabiat. And this speech in particular, I think, highlighted all of the antagonisms I described in the preceding and the corresponding mechanisms of cultural intimidation between different classes, between different generations, between town and country, and between Palestinian refugees and quote unquote native Jordanians. Dr. Abdul Latif said, "I know that with this repetition of this action, mass wedding," as he made a sort of cyclical gesture with his hands, that we are building a higher good. He says, "When I saw them in this hall, I said to myself, this is a national celebration. People celebrate familially, people celebrate tribally, people celebrate by different names, but this celebration is a national celebration." And the emphasis on nation or watan seemed a direct challenge to people like Abu Sakr, who would portray the Chastity Society and the Islamic movement more broadly as a foreign entity. Rather, he wanted to emphasize to the crowd his desire to seize the mantle of legitimacy from competing institutions like the extended kin group and the state. Yet doing so was itself a necessarily exclusionary gesture as well, one that we will see even Dr. Abdul Latif clearly and consciously saw as such. Launching into something of a Jeremiad, he emphasized the people of Salt, a notoriously clannish but also wealthy area on the suburbanizing edge of the Jordanian capital of Amman. Calling out the mechanisms of cultural intimidation that I have been describing, he exclaimed, "There are places in Salt. There are tribal and familial marriages, which wage huge amounts. And all of the resources go to the celebration, making food or shooting fireworks and bullets for the occasion. And it's all an exorbitant cost, and it's all an ignorant cost. Those doing it are doing it by themselves and for themselves." Apparently understanding that it did not exactly sound like a paragon of Muslim kindness and charity at the moment, he sought to check his anger, saying, "I'm very sorry, conversely, that I'm creating opposition against others, but there is selfishness, there is self-interest, there is distance from the general meaning of national service," and on and on and on. By this point, the ways in which the Chastity Society's attempt to legitimate people's marriages have increasingly placed its representatives on the defensive should seem somewhat familiar. For one thing, promoting mass weddings opens the Chastity Society up to many of the same accusations that beset attempts of ascended kin groups to legitimate marriages, accusations of stinginess, duplicitous motives, and exclusivity. But these are merely particular instances of the more general problem of legitimacy's reliance on social recognition, as well as the perils of the sort of participatory technocracy I have been describing. Seen in this light, the Chastity Society is always at risk of being recognized not as an alternative to the extended kin group in the state, but rather as a pale imitation. The same could be said, however, for the state and the extended kin group in relationship to either each other or the Chastity Society itself. For their part, individuals and families can certainly come under intense censure for their attempts to legitimate marriages. At times, they must take their problems to the state Sharia courts, which help endow the state, the courts, and Islam more generally with the legitimacy to define the nature and prerogatives of families and individuals. But as the state Sharia courts have come to play a larger role in legitimizing marriages, they have also been forced to recognize some of the prerogatives of the extended family, including the importance of the wedding and the authority of senior males. The Chastity Society likewise grew out of the Sharia courts, further disseminating its categories, even as it used them to articulate a critique of the state and the broader society that mobilized figures like the unmarried youth and the woman divorced before consummation as indictments of the existing political order. In this manner, a whole range of institution building projects have emerged from, and indeed been exacerbated and transformed by, a whole range of gendered and generational conflicts that increasingly give shape to the politics that we see across the Middle East. The sort of participatory technocracy that I've been describing grows out of existing power structures and often extends their reach, but it also frustrates and complicates attempts of pre-existing authority figures from state authority to family patriarchs to realize their own projects. And I think I'll leave it there and open the floor to questions. So thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Geoff. That's quite a lot to get our heads around, actually. But it's obviously an absolutely fascinating area of demography, politics, and religion. I'm just going to be very gross because it's not at all my specialist arena, but just to sort of explore how much you would link or extend some of these pressures of this inability, this growing stratification and inability for young men to get legitimate marriage to broader Islamic activist movements all over the world, Boko Haram, Taliban, a lot of examples where this issue must be very fundamental, I expect.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that this is, and this phenomenon of mass weddings in particular is a sort of a pan-regional phenomenon. So you see this all the way from sort of Morocco to Malaysia, that you see similar groups, often themselves called the Chastity Society as well, that are doing similar things. And they're all very much in conversation with each other and copying each other's best practices and all. So there's a whole sort of world in which this sort of marriage activism happens. Now, of course, this sort of marriage activism sits, I guess, on a sort of a spectrum, we could define it in various ways. Oh, can you not hear me?
Is that me?
Could you stop your screen share, Geoff?
I can't hear you at the moment. Can anybody else?
Yeah.
Sorry, I lost you there. Can anybody else hear?
Yeah, let me stop the screen share.
It's share, not share screen. Others can hear. It's maybe just me.
Okay, are we getting better sound now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So there's a whole sort of phenomenon of these sort of mass weddings across the region. And then this also, of course, sits in an interesting relationship to sort of more violent ways of sort of contesting these sorts of things, right? So obviously, a lot of this is basically growing out of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think the most interesting work that's been done on mass weddings aside, that I've seen is by Islah Jad, who works on this in Palestine, where there was basically a whole sort of arms race in the mid-2000s between basically the Fatah, which is the PLO, and Hamas, where they were both basically getting into the business of mass weddings in this sort of tit for tat sort of way. And basically being, I think, funded by their respective patrons of the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. And so we can see how, the Muslim Brotherhood obviously has its own perspective on how marriage activism represents this particular kinds of politics, but you can also see much more extreme approaches to this. And again, I think that the example of Boko Haram would be probably that example of actually literally just sort of kidnapping people and trying to sort of press them into marriage. But we also see similar things with ISIS and stuff, right? So, there's a lot of ways in which this sort of issue around sort of marriage crystallizes, I think, a lot of social anxieties. But I mean, also this clearly resonates in the West too, because these sort of social phenomenon also, of course, travel in that way as well. So I think that there's that's part of the story as well.
Yeah, I was most enjoying the discussion of the structural discussion on the ritual processes in the beginning, especially with the clean versus dirty hands, and or possible, probably dirty hands, and these issues about kind of traditional hospitality as well, because I mean, everything that I know about Jordan or Syria is so much emphasis on that kind of open and accessible hospitality, which presumably the hotel security and exclusivity just completely destroys, I expect.
Yeah, though it is interesting how then it's the hotel's fault, not your fault. So you're kind of outsourcing that role to them. But yeah, so I mean, I think that the issue of hospitality, I think, is particularly interesting in all of this, and becomes very fraught, right? And to the degree that you know, you do these 5-star hotel weddings, you are kind of opting out of a certain kind of sociality, and you can really, I think, kind of see how there's a sort of a schismogenic, if you will, I guess, to take it back to the sort of the real dawn of everything. Maybe we can start bringing in some of these issues of schismogenesis here. Might be an interesting move to make, given the wider series, right? Yes. So I think that we could maybe talk about how there are two groups of people that are sort of very consciously elaborating distinctions in relationship to each other, and they're trying to kind of do the opposite of what the other one is doing. And so there's an interesting coordination, I think, where you know, sort of the 5-star hotel wedding kind of, I think, almost because it's so proximate to these sort of more traditional, you know, confabs, right? It's all the more sort of clean and proper because it has to sort of, you know, sort of assert its fundamental alterity to quote unquote tradition. And of course, we can also talk about the invention of tradition itself, right? So the dish mensef, which is Jordan's national dish, is of course itself undergone a fascinating transformation over time, right? So if you go back to the 19th century or earlier, you wouldn't really have had rice in Jordan at all, right? And in fact, it used to be that they would just sprinkle a little bit of rice on top as almost like a luxury good. And then the majority of the dish would basically be bread, because wheat requires less water, and so you can grow it more locally. And what's happened over time is, as rice has gotten cheaper and bread's gotten more expensive, the ratio has flipped, and now you have a tiny little bit of bread at the bottom and a lot of rice, you know, growing up at the top. There are other ways in which, you know, sort of mensef is also sort of a moving target as well. And the sort of the adoption of this one particular dish as sort of Jordan's national meal becomes very much tied up also with sort of the loss of the West Bank and the attempt to assert this sort of Bedouin identity over and against the Palestinian identity, that follows that sort of political split. So in a lot of ways, you know, when we do look at these things, I mean, you can, I guess, sort of pick some holes in this and sort of see the invention of tradition very much afoot here. And it's sort of, there's, I think, a very interesting dialectical relationship that between the sort of the hotel wedding on the one hand, and this very particular way of construing tradition on the other, which is not to say, of course, that people don't eat with their hands all the time anyway. I mean, it's not that people are just eating with their hands to scandalize their, you know, urban, you know, sort of soi-disant or whatever. But I think that's definitely an added benefit, you know, and once you can do it, it's hard not to enjoy the fact that you have this skill and you can kind of take a little bit of schadenfreude perhaps in watching other people sort of not really having it down, which I guess makes me a bad person, but there you go.
Anybody who's got some more background who can chip into this discussion?
Well, I think that, I mean, for me, what I was most interested to see your reaction to was focusing on this issue of legitimacy, which I think is a very interesting topic for feminist anthropology and anthropology more generally, in terms of thinking about what does this term actually mean. And I'm particularly interested, of course, in how the concept of legitimacy applies both in relationship to patriarchy, in relationship to sort of the recognition of sort of basically paternity in particular, but also how it has this very crucial role in sort of the constitution of the state, right? And so you see this concept that sort of brokers between the sort of the patriarchal family and also the state, and how it sort of does not identical work in both of those contexts, but it does move between them in very interesting ways, I think. And we can see that basically being worked out here very explicitly through ritual.
Yes, yeah. I mean, as you say, there's so little visibility or space there, except the glimpses that you're mentioning in those historic contracts for women's agency at all. But presumably, women are significant and influential in the background, but it's just not. It's not part. It's not an aspect of that legitimacy, or it doesn't appear so.
Just say that in the iconography and the pictures and photographs of the papers, it's just I think I'm right in saying I didn't see the face of a single woman. I didn't see a single woman. I mean, just in the mass wedding, it's all this wonderful jubilation, all men. When we do see the women, they're all beautifully white, but completely covered up. And when I looked at the statistics of the people who can represent the bride, I think that, I mean, obviously the female relatives that don't stand a chance, but even the mother's brother, I think it's 0.001% or something compared with everybody else. I mean, it is a somewhat patriarchal arrangement.
Yeah,
we knew that, and I'm not saying anything.
Well, I'm glad you bring that up, actually. Yeah, because so I definitely generally women didn't want to be photographed by me. So I generally was very careful not to take pictures of people without their permission. So that meant that the photographs skew very male. It's interesting from the Chastity Society is a particularly interesting case. I'm really glad you brought up those pictures, actually, because they had this whole thing, actually, that all the women had to be covered, but they said they didn't care. They were just concerned about the women's relatives getting mad at them. And so the way they framed this was, the guy said basically, I don't care what what you wear, but we have to be sort of more correct than correct. And because people are already sort of questioning us and they think that we're bad, we have to sort of follow all the customs and traditions, even though we think they're backwards. So from their perspective, it's also very interesting, right, is how they're kind of negotiating this. So on the one hand, they're taking this sort of hyper modern, gauzy white sort of wedding garb, which isn't at all sort of traditional, right? But then they're also sort of merging it with these traditional norms around, sort of feminine visibility in the public sphere, and holding to this sort of very, I guess, rigid idea of sort of women's presentation in public, not necessarily out of any conviction. In fact, to the contrary, they think that this is bad. And actually, if I showed you other pictures of the Chastity Society, and actually, I probably should have included some of these. There actually will show pictures of women, often pictures exclusively of women from workshops and training courses that they often host by women and for women. And so there are those pictures, and maybe I should have actually included one of those to sort of complicate the picture a little bit. But you're absolutely right to draw attention to that picture on the Sharia Court, that picture from the Chastity Society. And there is a very interesting story that I'm glad I got the chance to expand on there.
Yeah, you might as well go for it.
Yeah. And then you were also pointing out about how even the sort of the mother side of the family has sort of little status as potential guardians, and that's especially as agents, and that's also, I think, very indicative of the local gender ideologies. And again, right, I mean, the thing about the interesting thing about the Sharia Courts perspective about things like guardianship is that it's all very much framed in sort of a discourse of vulnerability, right? And so from their perspective, I mean, in a lot of ways, there's this sort of very sort of thin line between the concerns of the Chastity Society and, for instance, concerns around human trafficking that I think we increasingly see today, right? So for instance, there was one very interesting case of a Syrian refugee who'd come to the court, and she basically showed up as would sometimes happen. Basically, she didn't have her father because her father was being held incommunicado in Syria. So she just brought as many of her other relatives as she could, right? And so she was trying to, sort of basically say, well, I don't have my father, but I have like these other male relatives, right, who can vouch for the fact that I'm not being trafficked, I'm not being kidnapped, I want to marry this guy, I'm not being sort of sent off to ISIS or whatever. Right. And the Sharia courts was just very uncomfortable with this, and they ultimately did marry her in the name of the court, interestingly, but not in the but that was how it was framed. But there was this deep concern that you have to have someone who's looking out for the woman's interests, because there was this idea that women could be taken advantage of. And then their idea is that the most obvious person who's going to look out for a woman's interest is going to be basically her closest family members. Now, I think we can all think about why there are many reasons why that might not be true at all. But that's basically how the Sharia courts ends up sort of trying to solve this issue. So I think it's interesting also to think about how this politics of vulnerability then sort of interacts with sort of contemporary issues.
Mm. Mm.
There's a question in the chat.
Yes. Oh, good. JLK, do you want to speak? Do you want to jump in? Or maybe can't. About asking if this marriage crisis is going to lead to new political revolutions in the near future. What's your sense about that?
Yeah, I'm very much, I guess, leery of predicting anything, because I of course I didn't really see the Arab Spring coming particularly. So I mean, I'm not very sort of, I don't have a good record on these things. I guess I have a couple of things that I would point out just as observations, which I guess might help answer this question, and you can kind of interpret how you will. But I think that the first thing that I would point out is that definitely within the region itself, there's a humongous amount of anxiety that this is a form of political instability. And so the King of Jordan, for instance, likes to talk about what he calls a youth bulge, which basically means to him a sort of a danger that if they can't, basically sort of marry these people off and sort of get these shiftless young men, sort of into employment and, with responsibilities and something to lose, then they're not going to be really invested in the system. They would make very good revolutionaries. And so there's a way in which I think, especially for some of these regimes, they see this as a problem they would like to be solving. Now, of course, in their own way, of course, I think the Muslim Brotherhood also sees this as an interesting issue from a different angle. I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood necessarily thinks that shiftless young men make particularly good or bad revolutionaries. I think that if you look at sort of periods when the Muslim Brotherhood has been sort of much more sort of active in resistance to various states, and periods when it's not, you often see that some of their most devoted, sort of activists are married, and that doesn't necessarily dissuade them from challenging authority. So I don't think that they necessarily think that, sort of marriage is going to, quiet people down. I think if they did, they probably wouldn't be so eager to marry off all their supporters. And then I think that, I think if you look at it from the perspective of, sort of the average person on the street, I think that there is a way in which this is kind of just one of many ways in which the state is shown to be lacking, right? And I mean, personally, I think that there's something interesting and indicative in the fact that the marriage crisis tends to be articulated primarily in terms of a sort of a lack of access to weddings, rather than a lack of access to housing. And I've kind of pressed a lot of the people in the Islamic movement on this. But I mean, to me, this sort of speaks to, I guess, my own sort of ideological priors. I tend to be more of a materialist. And so for me, sort of, I look at the amount of money it costs to put on a wedding. I look at the amount of money it costs to build a house, or sort of get, a down payment on it, or sort of, get a mortgage or something in a city. And clearly the bigger chunk of money seems to me like the bigger obstacle. Sort of there's different ways of thinking about this, sort of if you are, sort of maybe of a different persuasion than me, you might say something like a sort of a man who told me once, when I was talking to him about this, he says, well, you just rent. And then, I rented, I even lived with my parents, and it was very awkward, living with your spouse and your parents in a small apartment, but Allah Karim, God is generous. And, sort of, then once we did it, we were blessed with, sort of the money we needed to get a house. And then, everything kind of worked itself out. Right. And so there, I think you see this more kind of idealist kind of way of thinking about this, where it really is, I guess, more about a matter of legitimacy and about sort of recognition than it is about the sort of the material preconditions for life, which is maybe more of how I would sort of parse things. But I'm not necessarily convinced that I'm right about this, and sort of the guy I was talking to is wrong. I mean, it did work out for him, right? And I mean, he in a way, I think he knows his own experience, and I wouldn't sort of second guess his own experience.
Any other questions? I'm just thinking about this week, where all over the metro they suddenly splashed the demographic information about the majority of women have not had, this is in London, majority of women, or in England and Wales, the majority of women have not had a child by 30. And what are the possible causes on that? And of course, how housing access is a major potential contribution, and how much that is, how much that is a challenging to our splendid conservative law and order government in near future, Brexiteer government. It is kind of an interesting comparison, really, in some ways. They've got a real lack of kind of evident religious involvement, but obviously the housing factor and the material factors seem to be very, very powerful. Rather than aspect where legitimation isn't so much the question, but we have societies with such a strong, and what you've mentioned about the refugees and the trafficking, it's such a strong history, a recent history of that, those issues becoming fraught with Western colonial war intervention and so forth, causing that. So yeah, there are, yeah, so obviously legitimation must be a large part of that aspect. So that case of the refugee woman with no male relatives is a very salient example.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to kind of put this into a global perspective for precisely this reason, because in a lot of ways, this actually does seem to be a much wider spread phenomenon, and it's the sort of the rising marriage ages, decreased fertility, even sort of decreased sexual activity, of course, is another aspect, right? So there, even before the pandemic, which I'm sure has only exacerbated all this in many ways, there was a fascinating piece in the Atlantic that was about this idea of a sex recession. And the idea that basically just across the board, sort of wherever you look, people are having less sex. And what's interesting, though, I guess, is how this is sort of parsed and understood in different cultures. So this is something I do actually with my undergrads, where I try to tie this in to actually the Mead-Freeman debate, which I think is an interesting way in which this also has its own interesting history in anthropology, right? Where we think about adolescent sexual precocity as being a long-term, sort of hot button issue in anthropology. And what's interesting, right, from if any of you are unfamiliar with the Mead-Freeman debate, this is basically Margaret Mead is, of course, one of the sort of pioneers of feminist anthropology. She sort of goes to Samoa with the sort of the crazy idea of listening to women. And she comes back with some interesting findings, which of other things basically sort of makes the argument that a number of these women have had sort of sexual experiences prior to marriage, which I think was shocking at the time in America. But then by the time this other guy comes along, who's kind of, his name's Derek Freeman, he's a sort of an arch sociobiologist who wants to basically sort of trash her reputation and sort of debunk her work. He basically sort of makes an argument that this is all made up and that there's actually, sort of the Samoans have a cult of virginity, in fact. Now, of course, what's most notable to me is just how much American society has changed between when Margaret Mead is writing and when Derek Freeman is writing. And I would argue that what's really going on here is it's not the Samoans who changed so much as America and sort of the West changed. And what was considered scandalous and racy in 1920, by 1980 was very sort of vanilla, right? And that's basically sort of a lot of what that debate actually kind of boils down to. But this issue, I think, more generally, right, of how do societies think about, sort of youth sexuality, and how does that get sort of discussed, and also how does it change over time, right? Because I think, again, right, if from a certain perspective, there's, I think, tendency to want to essentialize things like sex, but I would make the opposite argument that we need to historicize things like this, and we need to look at how in certain time periods, sort of, sexuality may be very experimental and people might have a lot of it. And in other periods, they might not so much. And we certainly, and I think in this time period, seem to be in a moment where people are having a lot less sex in a number of ways. certainly within the bounds of wedlock, but it seems like even outside of that as well, for a whole host of reasons. It's not completely clear why, but it is very interesting how so many different societies approach it very differently. So you can look, obviously, sort of seeing how this is unfolding in the Middle East, I think, is a very interesting case study. But you can even see differences, for instance, between the US, continental Europe, the UK, and say Japan, right? So in Japan, this is often sort of framed as a sort of much like the Middle East, as a sort of an absolute crisis, right? And as one of my colleagues who works on Japan says, is sort of, they call it part of the wacky Japan frame, right? Of, sort of othering Japan in all of these ways, when in fact, actually sort of declining fertility and, decreased sexual experimentation is happening in the West as well. But what's ironic, of course, is, for instance, if you look at how this is handled in the US, or Britain, this is seen as an unalloyed good. It's sort of seen as great that people are having less sex oftentimes, especially before marriage. This is seen as, sort of decreasing disease and delinquency and all these other things. Now, the most interesting reaction, I think, comes from Scandinavia, where this is also seen as a bit of a crisis, but it's seen as more of a crisis in terms of this idea that that young people should sort of experiment with their sexuality under the watchful eyes of their parents, which I think to a lot of sort of Americans and British people, they find this hilarious. And this is actually sort of itself become grist for the tabloids, where the tabloids will sort of make these sort of run these sort of funny articles about, can you believe that the Swedes are concerned that their kids aren't having enough sex? But this also has ethnographic significance as well, because I've even sort of clashed with one of my colleagues who's from Scandinavia, who sees this issue of divorce before consummation and these increasing sort of wait times between sort of the initial contract signing and the final marriage as itself being a form of parentally endorsed dating, which again, I think is sort of, lines up very closely with the Scandinavian experience and sort of mores. Now, of course, when I've tried to sort of run this idea by my Jordanian friends, they look in absolute horror. I'm of course not completely convinced she's wrong, but certainly I've sort of violated a taboo by suggesting that people who I may know and think are getting one over on their parents may actually not be getting one over on their parents. I think this all sort of speaks to how this is a very interesting space. There's a lot to be learned and mined, I think, in this space ethnographically, in terms of thinking about human societies more generally in our contemporary moment.
Any more thoughts? Anybody? Chris? Ian? Anybody?
I have a question.
Oh, thank you.
Great.
So I was just going through the introduction of the 2017 article on the same topic, and I was just wondering if Jeffrey can expand on the final sentences in his introduction, where I know he kind of expands more so in the conclusion, but I was just wondering if you could kind of, just provide more details where you say, in the conclusion, I suggest that the symmetry between Islamist and Western interventionist approaches to gender and the centrality of objection to their shared language of contention should make us skeptical of persistent attempts to differentiate these discourses. Perhaps more can be gained by exploring the hidden and often sublimated assumptions that constitute their shared ground. So if you can just kind of expand more on this, I'm really interested in this idea, especially as it pertains to this topic.
Yeah, thank you. So this is from an article called Disciplining Muslim Men, where I basically go a lot more in depth on the Chastity Society, and especially their mass weddings and training courses for newlyweds. And part of this, again, it grows out again of a lot of this literature looking at, and I think rightfully critiquing these sort of Western humanitarian rescue discourses that want to sort of save Muslim women, what Paul Lamar associates with the human security state. And I think that there's a lot of reasons why this idea of saving Muslim women is something that people should be very skeptical of. But at the same time, there's also sort of a Coles to Newcastle or Ice to Iceland quality to these discourses, because of course, Islamic activists themselves are deeply concerned with protecting and even saving Muslim women themselves. They also, of course, I think, are concerned about the benighted fate, or the fate of the benighted Western woman as well. And I've often found it interesting when Muslim women will tell me about how happy they are that they're Muslim women and not Western, because from their perspective, they see Western women as being victimized by sort of Western society, sort of issues of divorce, abandonment, sort of lack of support for childcare and things like that. And of course, all sorts of things related to the circulation of pornography and how that shapes their idea of sort of Western sexual practices. And so there's, on the one hand, I think this idea of sort of both sides of this East-West relationship, seeing the other as potentially abject, and then also seeing a potential for redemption through these sort of projects of sort of disciplining men in various ways. Though, of course, what's interesting is that I think that to the credit of the Chastity Society, to a certain degree, if you look, for instance, at their training courses for newlyweds, they're very concerned about the potential for the male beneficiaries of these marriages to basically ruin it for the couple. And most of the guidance that they give in their training courses for newlyweds is basically aimed at their sense that the men are going to be the problem in these relationships rather than the women. Now, that being said, of course, there's also, I think, a strong class dimension to what's going on in the Chastity Society, right? Where obviously you have a class differential between the men who are organizing the mass wedding and the men who are benefiting from it, right? And so in a sense, what, of course, the more elite men are doing by disciplining Muslim men is not, I think, so indistinct from what Westerners, and I wouldn't necessarily exclude myself at all from this, think they're doing by taking an interest in sort of things, issues of gender and sexuality in the Muslim world. That there often is this aspect, I think, of trying to assert one's own sort of superiority, if not engage in projects of sort of self-making and self-actualization through these attempts to sort of save vulnerable people and discipline people who might sort of do them harm. And so what I'm doing in the article, basically, and I'd say that this talk is a kind of orthogonal to this argument, but you're right, I think, Sarah, that this sort of does draw in on this, is I want people to sort of think about how things that they might initially see as very other are actually maybe more familiar than they might initially want to think they are. And also to maybe sort of induce a little bit of self-reflection about sort of what these sorts of investments in issues around abjection or vulnerability might be doing, right? Is this really a good basis for a politics or an ethics? What are the limitations of things like vulnerability and abjection, right? I mean, I think that in some ways, there's this idea when you think about, ideas of suffering, for instance, that we all suffer, right? And so I think that there is this idea that by focusing on suffering, focusing on the fact that all humans are vulnerable, that we do, of course, realize sort of universal human ecumene. But I don't think that that's the sole, all that's going on, right? I think abjection is more than just being brought low, right? I think we all are brought low, but I think abjection goes a little bit beyond that, right? Abjection is also about casting off, right? And so I think that there's this way in which suffering often has this double valence, where on the one hand, it draws people closer, but it also tends to hold them at a distance and actually kind of put them in a sort of a box, if you will. And I want people to be kind of aware of how this dynamic happens. And even how ethnography itself and anthropology is often complicit in these sorts of dynamics. So I don't know how effective I've been at avoiding the snares of these sorts of issues in my attempt to present Jordan's marriage crisis, but I am trying to kind of deliberately tell this in a particular way, where I kind of minimize my attempt to make any sort of normative claims. I kind of basically sort of just, kind of try to explain people's behavior and actions in their own terms, and then let you kind of make up your mind about, sort of what you think about what's going on, without necessarily trying to say that we should do anything in particular, that there's any sort of solution or intervention that needs to be made, but rather just to sort of let people see the dynamics and hopefully also to kind of see a little bit of their own, sort of political concerns and their own sort of their own sort of world reflected back to them a little bit.
Got any more questions at all? I was wondering if you could say a little more on the training, because you didn't you were saying you would have shown that there were women involved quite significantly in these training, and yet the discipline seems to be mainly applied to the men. So are men going through these training things?
Yeah, so generally, so generally as a condition for participation in the mass wedding, you have to go to this training course, right? So, and the sense I got anyway from my participant observation was that the women were much more sort of actively involved and committed to this than the men. And there are a lot of other sort of training courses that are women only. Basically, the only training course, as far as I knew, that was mixed gender was this one that was aimed at the beneficiaries. And it's a very interesting, it's great that I get a chance to talk about it because it's fascinating. So the way it works is that it's a whole day. It's at the Jordanian Engineers Association, which is a sort of basically it's a union that's controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood. So they get to use the facilities off hours. And you sort of file into this nice modern building, and they divide people up by gender. You have the men in front and the women in back. You have 4 parts. So you have the first part is you have a sheikh from the Sharia Courts. And then you have this sort of male trainer who's a sort of a prominent Islamic activist. And then you had a sort of a female trainer who is a sort of a nurse and also an intellectual. And then at the end of the day, they divided everybody up by gender for sexual education, which is basically given by a doctor. So the men were very skeptical at first, and they didn't seem to be very into it. Over the course of the thing, it was basically the sheikh sort of lecturing the men on their responsibilities as husbands, to a sort of an interesting chorus in the background of the women making sort of rising ahs and ohs, of assent, sort of there's mercy in Islam, and the women saying yes, and then at the end of it. They asked about the questions, if anyone had any questions, and then not having any, they started to quiz the audience on what had happened. And of course, the men just sort of sat there quietly. The women had been taking very careful notes about all of their rights, and then began to sort of relate back from their notes what they were entitled to. And then the guy said, well, I want to hear from the men, and the men were sort of shuffled around. And then, the one man asked a question about whether a man had a right to sort of forbid guests who might be unwelcome and sow dissension in the house, which I thought was a not very subtle sort of critique of what was going on. And then eventually they were all released, and sort of I recall, and I write in the article of one guy shouting out, "This course isn't teaching anything but my ass." And basically after the women were allowed to leave first, of course, so they could go off and get their refreshments. And then the men finally got to go out and smoke their cigarettes after all the women had left. And then you had the sort of these 2 training sessions, which were just adorable to watch, where, for instance, you had this guy teaching the men to say nice things to their wives. They had them all divide up by gender, and they all had to write down sort of nice phrases you could say to your partner, sort of. So then he called up this man to the front of the room, and he sort of looks very bashfully at his partner as he sort of looks down and he says, "Oh, my moon, sort of my stars, my love." And the women just are sort of tittering in the background, and it was very cute. And then they divided them up by gender at the end of the day for sexual education. And this was the point, I think, that the men were finally kind of won over. So what was interesting is they were not at all swayed by the Sharia stuff, but there was this interesting merging, which I talk about in the article, of Islamic ethics and a sort of a biomedical discourse that they did find very compelling. And I knew this was the case because after he was done and all the men had basically been listening with rapt attention to, basically this very sort of graphic description of what they were going to be doing in a week, he said, "And if any of you need my phone number," and then this one man says, "Oh, yes, give us your phone number." Every man around the table pulls out his telephone and starts writing down this guy's phone number just in case he needs any sort of last minute instruction. By that point in the day, they had kind of bought into this idea. But again, it was very much framed in this kind of disciplining Muslim men kind of way. It's sort of you could do you have to be very careful, gentle. The Arabic phrase "shway shway" was used a lot, which means slowly, slowly. And there was a big emphasis on sort of restraint, and about how masculinity is about sort of restraining oneself and having control. And the men were really buying into it, and especially I think when it had this sort of very material sort of biomedical kind of framework to it. So if you want to read more about that, I talk about this at length in the article. But this is sort of another side to what they're doing.
Title of the article, if you can, in the chat, so people can check it out. Would be good, or if Sarah can. Sounds good. And it's it has the quality of the kind of initiation ritual, doesn't it? It has. It's as if it's kind of new format of kind of ritual process in some sense there.
Yeah, and this is exactly what so this is exactly what I do in the book, is I compare this to the way in which sort of sexual education is also part of the sort of the wedding rituals as well, right? And often, of course, in wedding rituals, this takes the form of bawdy songs that are metaphorical.
Right.
So what's interesting is how you get this shift from these sort of bawdy songs, oftentimes using actually the similar shui shui sort of language even. So there's an interesting kind of different registers coming in as well. But these bawdy songs are basically now being kind of replaced by this sort of more restrained, sort of learned and literate form of biomedical discourse. But not necessarily completely getting rid of a lot of the ethical and sort of value judgments that are sort of latent in them.
Yeah, but who sings? Are the bawdy songs all traditionally sung by men, or do women respond with them? I don't know.
Yeah. So there's definitely women sing bawdy songs as well. Though again, right, what is a bawdy song? You'll get different reactions. So there was this one song that some of the little girls started singing, copying some of the older women, which was talking about the prick from the Indian needle that happens on the wedding night. And sort of, I asked a number of people what they made of this. Not of course referencing the fact that the little kids had picked up on this. But just asking about this particular song, and some people were like, I mean, obviously, what are you, why are you even asking us? Sort of, are you really that dense? But then one guy said, no, it's not. It means exactly what, it's just to fit the rhythm, right? It's there's no meaning whatsoever. I don't know what you're talking about. So you can draw your own conclusions about that. Yeah, definitely the sense I get is the bawdy songs are sung all around. And definitely also, sort of on the way back from the wedding, and this is again something I talk about in the book, this one in particular, it wasn't even a wedding, it was a proposal delegation where I ended up getting to be in the vehicle with the drum, which is always the most fun vehicle to be in when you're driving back from a proposal delegation. So all the women were doing these rounds of this song where they were sort of basically teasing all the men about, sort of, is that your girlfriend? Is that your girlfriend? Is that your girlfriend? And then to sort of bring you along. And then I got kind of incorporated into the song, but they weren't quite sure if that was okay because I was a little bit, in this liminal category between, sort of, stranger, not quite kin, but, maybe marriageable, not really quite sure what the deal with that guy is, right? And so they weren't sure if that was quite okay, but then they just sort of, kept on going and started picking on other guys. So definitely, I mean, sort of even in these incredibly, I mean, by all, for all intents and purposes, incredibly conservative communities, I think that this sort of bawdy song is sort of very much, sort of a standard practice.
Yeah. So there's interesting continuities as well as discontinuities. It's kind of interesting. Have we got any more questions at all? Because otherwise we're going to you're going to come to an end. But is there anything else any more references or anything you'd like to tell us, Geoff? Affection and Mercy is your book for anybody who's interested in going further on this topic. I think it's absolutely fascinating area. As you say, it's got very universal aspects to it of the marriage, sex, economics, and the whole age time bomb in relation to current situation. So I think that was very fascinating. And thank you very much, because we need to hear more about this kind of subject coming from, reflecting from a different place than our own society. Yeah. And anybody else would like any other words? But thank you very much. That was wonderful. And just to say for next week, anybody would like to come back for next week, we got another in the series Chris is giving on the grammar of world mythology, which is looking at bird nester stories, particularly the towers from earth to sky. That includes South America, that includes Jack and the Beanstalk fairy tales, and it includes Aboriginal Australian mythology. So yeah, come back for more of that grammar of world mythology if you can. But meanwhile, thank you very much, Geoff.
Thank you for having
that
me.
was great coverage on this topic. Great education for us. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening.
Thanks a lot.